So again, you see how those rules, if you know them guys, is enough foundation to convert these endgames that look so complicated. Okay, so here we have another example just to make sure that you guys got this idea of the pawns on the 6th rank. Okay guys, after this lesson, you can say that you have a good foundation when it comes to rook endgames, and this is very important because we know that typically rooks are the last pieces to come into the game, so they make it to the end game, and it is really difficult to know everything about them, but there are some guidelines, rules, and typical positions that if we know them, it should make our job way easier. So I'm going to show you these 10 rules that we have in front of us, or principles or ideas, whatever you want to call it. We're going to work on them. We're going to make sure, I'm going to show you positions, games, so that they actually stick and you guys get to use them in your own games. And you're going to see that they actually make a huge difference. Now, before we start with those examples, before we start drilling on these rules, let me show you what it feels like to have a good foundation when it comes to these endgames. If I show this position in front of you guys to any of my students, there are a few things that are going to point out. Number one, they're going to say, you know what? I realize my pawn is about to promote, but the rook is in front of the pawn, and they know by heart that rooks belong behind the pawns, and you could see this in one of the rules. So if in this case the black pieces did a great job, they have the rook behind the pawn. It doesn't matter if the pawn is yours or not, the rook wants to be behind the pawn, and we talked about this in one of those chords, right? Now they're going to identify this, and even though it's a little bit tough to make it work, there are like 3 resources, 3 ideas that are going to come to mind. Number one, they know that when this pawn is being pushed, there's something that is very important, guys. Many people who are not experienced, they just feel like they need to push the pawn all the way to be ready to remove the rook and promote. But many times it is a good idea to leave the pawn on the 6th rank. And what's the reason for it? Well, number one, this king, what the king wants to do is at some point, find a way to get to attack that rook so that the rook is not cutting him off, and then make his way to b7. But the problem is that even if that happens, let's say that magically the king got to b3 and the rook goes down, then magically the king shows up on b7. Now, all that the black pieces have to do is do check from behind, and this king can never get away from the checks. So that's where leaving the pawn on a6 makes sense. If we have the pawn on a6 instead, and I need you to use your visualization skills. Let's say that the king magically shows up on b7. If I start putting him in check from behind, that king could hide. So that pawn is going to give some shelter to the king. And then we remove the rook, and of course we can promote the pawn. So this is one of the main things we're going to mention because we have talked about this a lot, leaving the pawn on a6. Now, the other thing is, if the pawn is already on a7, well, the other resource that I'm looking for is if this king goes a little bit further up, I could put him in check from behind. So I remove my rook with a check, and then I follow up with promotion. So the black pieces, of course, are not going to allow you to do that. But then the last idea that they should be able to recognize is that if these pawns were not here, let's say that the black pawn is gone, well, I could do this. I could go rook h8, and even though this rook could get the pawn now, I'm going to go up rook h7, and that's going to be a skewer. In other words, let's say I get to do h6 here and the pawn takes, well, I could do rook h8, and now my pawn is about to promote, protected by the rook. If they just collect, then rook h7, and of course that's a very nice skewer. So again, guys, from a simple position like this, there are different patterns, resources, and ideas that if you're familiar with them, they're gonna make your job way simpler. Okay, so it's time to put into practice another rule that we have listed here on this 10, right? This rule has to do with the fact that 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th rank are typically stronger than 1 rook. And that's exactly what we're looking for over here. Like, look at this pawn on the 6th rank. If we could get this one also to e6, of course, without any of these pawns, because they cannot be there. We need them to be passed pawns. If that's the case, we should be able to win this. So how do we manage to do it? Well, we know we have talked about deflection, and that's what we should be doing in this endgame. And how should we do that? Well, guys, we have talked about deflection, but also in these rules, we have said it's not about how many pawns we have. It's just about the speed. We just need 1 to make it to the end. Also, don't be afraid to sacrifice material in order to get that activity, right? So in this case, I'm going to use deflection. I could, if I sacrifice this pawn, look, I want this pawn to go to e6, right? So if I wanted to do that, to remove this pawn to deflect it, I just need to do d5. And when they take, that's it. But then doing e6 in itself, I need to get rid of this pawn. Well, how do I deflect that pawn? Well, I'm going to have g6, they have to take. And then lastly, the only pawn that I have left is this one. And how do I deflect it? Well, with c6. So I'm pretty sure here d5 works. But if you just go g6, I'm threatening to take, to continue, all of that. When they take me, well, I'm going to go with d5. And then the same thing, I'm threatening to take, then I have my two passed pawns. I'm also threatening to do c6. All of this is in the air. When they take, well, finally I go with c6. Notice that I gave him two pawns. I'm left with only three, but these are just connected. Really, really powerful. So when they take, now we do pawn to e6. We have 7 pawns versus 2, but our 2 pawns are connected on the 6th rank. One of them is going to promote. So there's nothing they could do now. If they do, I don't know, push a pawn, well, this one is going to go to e7, then d7, and that's it. If they did something like, I don't know, this, well, e7, if they get in front, d7, and then I'm going to promote. So again, you see how those rules, if you know them, guys, is enough foundation to convert these endgames that look so complicated. Okay, so here we have another example just to make sure that you guys got this idea of the pawns on the 6th rank. So here, notice that we got one pawn on the 6th rank already. We're just waiting for the other one, and we talked about deflection. So we know that when there's a piece bothering us, a defender or something like that, we think of deflection, eliminating that piece, or simply obstructing it or something like that. We cannot obstruct that pawn. Deflection, if we do something like this, of course, it's just losing. So we gotta think of something like rook takes b2, and we gotta calculate. We're giving up our rook, so this one is more dangerous than the one before, but we already know that 2 pawns connected on the 6th rank, of course being passed, they're really powerful, typically more powerful than the rook. Now, before I show you the end of this game, which is pretty simple, if you already understand this, let me go, guys, from the very beginning. I'm not gonna go that deep into the moves again. So this is a queen's gambit, and after knight c3, we have knight f6. Now, in some of the streams, some of the lessons, I have told you how you could do this setup, typically to what we do in the Kali. So if you think about this, it's like the Kali with colors reversed, right? So we have the fianchetto on the queen side, the bishop goes to b7, and when they take on d5, of course, we replace that pawn with another pawn. So we've talked about this. I know, as the white pieces, pretty confusing, but those of you who have been here for long enough, you know what I'm talking about. So after bishop b7, we have castling and now c5. When we talked about the Kali, when we talked about this position, with the black pieces, we talked about knight e4 or c5. Sometimes we even do both together, right? So here's c5, bishop b1, rook c8. And now I'm just going to, you see knight e4, you see it sooner or later, that move comes in. And I'm just going to fast forward because I want to get to that endgame. So take, we trade pieces, we get to the endgame, b takes e5, rook on the 7th rank, rook f7, and of course, oh, look, the same move that I mentioned in one of the other exercises. g4, the idea, guys, is to break down this pawn chain. So king e6, then bishop a6, bishop d3, blockading that file, the rook cannot do much. King f6, take, c4, a5, a4. So you see, being energetic, pushing those pawns isolated, but they could help us. They could help us a lot. So rook d2, rook d8, a3, rook b8, and after they take, of course, we want to take with this pawn, guys. We want to create the pawn majority. If you take with the c pawn, yes, you get a protected pass pawn, very powerful. But if you take with the e pawn, you get the same thing, and now you're ready to get your pawn to the 6th rank. So after king f3, activating the king, they just did rook takes b2. Very complicated. Many people might be like, oh, you have to be a genius to do these moves. No, if you know these principles, and of course, a little bit of calculation, visualization, which is what we have been working on for the last few lessons, it should be enough to get this done. So they took c3, and now the pawns are going to promote. So rook b6, then king goes to h6, king h5, and then after c2, that's it. They cannot stop it. Even if they go behind it, d2, if they take the pawn, then I'm going to promote. And guys, I remember there was one lesson where I analyzed one of my games and the game ended up like this. Now, actually, I think I mentioned it. One of the games that I mentioned, that I analyzed, you can see this same position. I had two connected pass pawns and it was too much for the rook. So anyways, after they took on d3, they promoted, and that was the end of the game. Now, in this specific position, what you're going to see in practice, what decides the game, is rules number 1 and number 2. Golden rule: always be aggressive, be energetic. You don't want to be passive. So here, what the black pieces did was rook to c6, being passive, coming back here to defend the pawn. Instead, it was a better idea to just do rook to c5, and I'm now threatening to do pawn to b4. So let's say they did something, I don't know, g3, I'm going to do b4, and then take, I go rook to b5, putting pressure on b4. But now I'm at least being energetic, I'm putting some pressure, getting some counterplay. Now, in the actual game, you're going to see how after b3, they went rook to c6 passive, and now the white pieces are the one being energetic. So this is, I think, rule number 10. The king wants to be active, and for the most part in these rook endgames, the king gets in front of one of their passed pawns. That way the rook doesn't have to be worrying about it. The rook could go on and do something else. So we have, of course, king e4 being energetic, king e6, and now our rook is going to be putting pressure. This is what it means to be play actively. So h6, okay, so I'm going to go to rook g3, and I'm putting pressure on g7. Now king f6, okay, so now that the king moved, there's no opposition anymore. Well, I could do king to d5, and I'm penetrating. And guys, don't forget this, the initiative, it is very, very important. In the opening, middle game, end game, active pieces is always a positive thing to have. Now, in this case, it's not only about the active pieces, we have a pawn majority, and that's another rule that we talked about. So 3 versus 2, the king is where the pawn majority is. So after the rook goes to e6, of course, rook f3 check, king e7, then g3. Now g3 is just in case this rook ever gets to the 7th rank, they're not hitting that pawn. Now after g6, we have rook e3 putting pressure on the pawn, so we're forcing this king to go to f6 if they want to defend. But even though they defend, not only are they passive, that king is getting away from where the action is going to be, the pawn majority. So king f6, and now c4, we put our pawn majority in motion, we're gonna have a passed pawn. So pawn takes, rook e8, and now rook f3. So this king has to be careful if it goes to e7, because this one falls. So king goes to g5, further away from my passed pawn, and of course further away from this from their passed pawn. So c5, e4, h4 check, and then we're going to collect the pawn. So take on g3, take on e4, and we're happy to walk into this kings and pawns endgame. See, if they take and I take, my pawn is 3 squares away from promotion. So of course they didn't take, rook a8 instead, then c6, g5, they're going to create a passed pawn, but remember, it's about speed. Mine is going faster, it's gonna get to promote in 2 moves. So take, and now c7. That's it, my king is close enough to go and support. After king f3, we just need to put our rook in safety. So rook e1, cutting off that king even if it's not necessary, but more importantly, controlling the promotion square. And at this point, the black pieces resign. So guys, here again, nothing fancy, just keeping those ideas in mind. And again, if the black pieces had done something different, such as leaving the rook on c5, they would have had better chances to draw this game. So again, the better move is rook to c5, followed by b4, pawn takes, and rook b5. Now we're gonna collect on b4. Our rook is more active. This is a different story. Now I know that you might be asking, okay, what if when you do b4 they do something like c4? Well, remember this, I just did an energetic move. I'm hitting a5 as well. Now for those of you who are a little bit like, I knew that, I know that their pieces have to be active, this is not a big deal. Well, take a look at this position now. Notice how the black pieces are a little bit in trouble. Of course, 3 versus 1 on the queen side. It's not like they have much on the king side. This rook is really active. It already collected a pawn on a7, but you're going to see that by applying some of the rules that we just talked about, the black pieces could come back in this game. Now, don't forget, these are grandmasters playing these games. It's not like they just were playing blitz and they make a mistake. So in this position, let me actually go back before we get to it. Let me flip the board and let me go all the way to the beginning. Now, not a big deal. I'm not gonna go too deep into the opening moves, but just for you to see how this game went from a French defense all the way to that endgame. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time in the opening, just developing their pieces, castling, knight f6, knight e5, d takes e5, and now pay attention to this. So in the French, the Caro-Kann, any openings that you play, you're gonna get typical pawn structures, typical position types. And something that you get in the French is going to be this. After this c5 and d takes c5, notice how, even though they're gonna get the pawn back, notice how you get a 3 versus 2. And for many people, this is not a big deal. This is still in the middle game. There's so many pieces. There could be tactics, but the experienced players, they're going to keep an eye out for it. They know that if they get to an endgame, they have the pawn majority on the queen side. Now, very important, guys, when you have the pawn majority in the endgame, one of the rules is that our king needs to get to that pawn majority and then start pushing them. So keep that in mind, okay? Now, anyways, we keep going. Don't forget to pay attention to the pawn majority, right? So they trade, happy to get to the endgame, rook d1, queen h5, they put in pressure. And if they could finish this in the middle game with an attack, great. But in this case, it was not possible. They traded everything, it's okay. And c3, e5, the rooks get active, then f5, that's okay. Look, that rook went through the fourth rank and is putting pressure on a7. So you see, no matter what, you want to be aggressive, you want to be energetic. So b6, then g4, trying to break their pawn structure. But of course, they did pawn to e4, trying to keep the pawn chain together and not leaving any weak pawns. So take, now they're not together anymore, isolated pawn, and these two are connected, but at least the pawn structure is not as strong as it was before, right? So king f1, another rule that we talked about. So now the king is not only getting active, but is trying to get to where the pawn majority is. So of course, king f7, rook d4, rook e6, rook d7 check, and after rook e7 we have rook 4 to d5, putting pressure on the weak pawn. You see, so many weaknesses, and it's hard to defend them all. 1 and 2. So at this point they took rook takes e7, king g6, and then this is the position that I showed you. Definitely the black pieces are in trouble, but I'm going to flip the board one more time. Sorry about this if it is confusing, and pay attention to this. So the black pieces, how do you continue this game applying the rules that I showed you at the very beginning? Well, first rule that has to come to mind, golden rule, we have to be energetic no matter what. We cannot be passive. And don't forget that, guys, if the rook gets to the 7th rank, cutting off your opponent's king, it could be lethal. So that could be the beginning of a very strong attack. In this game, instead of trying to hold on and be passive, the black pieces went rook to d8, looking for that open file and get to the 7th rank. I know, 2nd rank, but from black's perspective, it is the 7th rank, right? So rook a6, they want to get the pawn, fine, I'm going to get to the 7th rank. Now they take, king to g5, activating the king. I just want to go there and create mating nets, complications. That's what I'm looking for. So after king e1, the rook needs to stay on the 7th rank. Now they cannot continue to attack me because I'm going to be hitting that pawn. So instead, rook b5, king g4, and at this point, they're looking for f4, king f3, e3, and then even checkmate back there. Notice how even though they got our pawns on the queen side, they have 3 passed pawns. Our threats are just really, really powerful. So instead of just letting us do f4, the white pieces go pawn to h3. So they have to give us a pawn, and then they take on f5. So they feel better about it, but now we have rook takes b2. You see, rook on the 7th rank, not only cutting off the king, but we're also trying to get those pawns from behind. So rook f4, we take another pawn, they take, and now the key here is another rule. When it comes to passed pawns, it's not about quantity. They have 2 passed pawns. It is about speed. So we got to get this one pawn that we have. We got to get it to promote as quickly as we can. So h5, c4, king gets out of the way, rook f4, and now rook c2. So this passed pawn, we're going to control it. They go rook h4. They don't like our passed pawn. King f3, and now we're attacking the 2 pawns. They have to give us 1. Now king d1, rook takes f2, c5, no big deal. Our king is still probably going to help us deliver some checkmate, or at least threaten checkmate. But more importantly, this king is coming towards the pawn, the last pawn standing for the white pieces. So they took, king d4, and that's it. This is going to be a draw. There's no way this king could participate, and if the pawn pushes or rook is going to go after, it's going to be rook and king. There's nothing they could do. So this game ended up in a draw. Now, guys, for those of you who are new to the channel, I'm assuming, by the way, that you already went over the Lucina and the Philidor as well. With the foundation you got there, and what we're doing here, definitely this should be very easy for you to understand. Okay, so assuming that you are not bored already, we have talked about how people don't like endgames because they're boring, but they're just really, really important. But assuming you're not tired, assuming you're not bored, let me ask you guys, we have just 2 quick positions to show you, and then I'm gonna leave you a homework to see if you actually are getting these. Now, this one, I just wanted to show it to you, and I want you to pause the video if you need to and think. If you had the white pieces, how would you continue? You have 2 connected pawns. Of course, they're passed pawns. Your opponent has a passed pawn far from everything else, right? So the question to you is, would you rather go ahead and collect that pawn, secure it, make sure that he has no counterplay, nothing at all, or would you go ahead and push the pawn so that you keep the 2 connected pawns? Just know that if you do h4, most likely it's going to be something like a5, and I'm guessing you're going to go behind it. The rook is going to defend, so you have now this fight, 2 connected pawns versus 1, or you could play it like this. You take on a7 and they take on h2, and then it's true that you only have 1 pawn, it is passed, but your opponent has nothing to get you in trouble with. So take some time, try to visualize that, compare, and let me know in the comments what you guys would do. Now, in this position, there are a few things to keep in mind. Number 1, you should know by now that if you take here and they take over, you're going to see that now this is just going to be very drawish. But this goes back to the Lucina, the Philidor, all of those basics that we learned in those 2 endgames. They could help you understand this better. But for the most part, this is just going to be 1 pawn. Guys, Rook Endgames, 1 extra pawn, many times it doesn't mean anything. It's really difficult to convert that, especially since your opponent's king is close enough and it could help out. Okay, so that's just what I wanted to mention with this position. And then the last position before I give you your homework is going to be this one. So you're in charge of the white pieces. The black pieces pawn is 3 squares away from promotion. So what would you do? How would you continue? Take your time, pause the video if you need to, and then we're going to talk about it. Well, when I show this to my students, what I hear the most is those who are inexperienced, they're going to say something like, oh, get the rook behind the pawn and try to put pressure on it. But that's not good enough. The king is going to come over and it's going to help the pawn promote. Your king is just too far away. Now, people who are more experienced, they immediately think of how in these Rook Endgames, our rook should be used to cut off the king, to create this barrier and separate the king from helping the pawn. And that's exactly what the first move is here, guys. That's it. Now, if they did something like just staying here, well, my king is going to come over and help. Or if they push the pawn, even if they find rook g5, many people tell me, well, I'm going to start bringing my king over, wait for the pawn to get here, and then I have enough time to go g1, c1, and c2. And it's fine. You're going to win. It's true that you're going to win like that. But the pattern that I want you to get from this position, number 1, that idea of cutting the king off, so rook g5. But then if the pawn just goes, to c3, you don't have to wait. You just go rook g3, you're just in time, no one can defend it, and you're just in time to get behind that pawn. Now you're going to collect it. So guys, with that, I'm going to leave it here. Please try to solve this, this homework. All I want you to know is tell me in the comments the plan that you'd have. Notice that it looks very standard, very quiet, but I would like to know what you're going to do. You feel free to tell me the specific moves, or at least what your plan is. I'm going to put this piece of mine here, I'm going to put this here, and that should be enough to win. So with that said, the only last thing that I want to ask you is to let me know which of these rules of the 10, you could say number 1, number 3, number 7, which of those you didn't really remember by heart. Like if you're playing in a Rook Endgames, which of those you know that wouldn't come to mind because you had never seen it before, or you just saw it but then forgot. Okay, so I trust that you're gonna let me know, and with that said, I will see you in our next lesson.